All right, my English 102 students, welcome to my soundstage of empty metal bookshelves. So today, in this video, I'm going to talk about the discussion board that you're doing for next week while I'm on jury duty. We're also going to, and how that's going to relate to your project 2, which is coming up after midterms. We're also going to talk a little bit about how we tie in scholarly sources with that Calzones example we talked about in class. And so with next week's discussion board, we're going to start looking at, how we're going to transition from project 1 to project 2. Something important to bear in mind, with project 1, we've had, these individual articles. Most of you have chosen to kind of stay with fairly consistent topics throughout. A number of you have also chosen to instead go with one topic and then to a different topic and then a different topic. And with project 1, both of those approaches work just fine. With project 2, on the other hand, you're looking at a single 3,500 word research paper. And so one extended work that brings all of your research together. And so next week during the discussion board, what you want to do is post about what are your ideas for a topic that will provide enough information for you to keep going and enough interest that you want to keep going. All right, and I really want to emphasize this. Choosing a topic you like helps a huge amount. It is very, very important for kind of keeping you on track, keeping you engaged. And additionally, if you like a topic, there's a good chance you already know a fair amount about it. And that right there, that background information you already have, will help a great deal as you start looking for sources. Now, with this, one of the most important things with your research is the ability to find and use scholarly sources. And so with your Article 4 due next week, remember that you need at least 2 scholarly sources and at least 1 primary source, and you need to tie those things together. With your scholarly sources, as we talked about before, finding those through Heartland Library is what I recommend as your starting point. You can also use Google Scholar to find those. But the most important thing is that you need to figure out a way to tie them in, even if you can't find scholarly sources that are specifically about your topic, right? So with today's example, we talked about calzones, and as we found, there are a ton of excellent primary sources you can find. We have DP Dough in Uptown Normal. You could go there and interview someone working there, interview the line cooks, the managers, the owner if possible. And through those interviews, get a sense of, how do they make a calzone? How do they market it? How do they keep their business running? You can also talk with the customers. The customers are likely to give you a less biased view about whether they like calzones or whether they like DP Dough's calzones in particular. Now, also too, with those in-person primary sources, you want to augment those with, online sources or newspaper sources. All right, the DP Dough website is likely to give a history of that restaurant, and it's possible that the person who founded it is not available for you to talk to. Also too, if you're looking at an older restaurant, say like Tobin's, for example, Tobin's has been around for a long time, and so there will be newspaper articles about it. There will be food reviews. If you have a restaurant reviewer who is talking about their personal experience at that restaurant, that is a great primary source, because that is an individual who has a vested interest in being accurate in their review. Readers will go to those restaurants, and if they disagree with what the reviewer said, they will stop reading those reviews. Now, on the other hand, if you have a newspaper article that is talking about Tobin's from the perspectives of other individuals that they have interviewed, that's going to be a secondary source. So if a newspaper went and interviewed 5 customers who have been to DP Dough and eaten the calzones, all right? That's a secondary source, all right? They are choosing which quotes to include. They are not describing their personal experience. The other thing to bear in mind is that some of the like sources you may have been discouraged from using in high school could be very helpful here. So for example, a YouTube video talking about calzones, excellent source. If you have a cooking show where someone is showing how to cook a calzone, or you have a cookbook that has a recipe for calzones, those are good sources. And when we talk about these types of sources, this is where the quality of the sources becomes very important. So for example, a cookbook that just gives a recipe and that's it, it's a primary source, but it might not be very helpful. On the other hand, if you have a web page where they give the recipe and then the writer is giving their personal experience of cooking this calzone and how much their kids loved it, that's going to be a more detailed source and likely more helpful. But in this stage, you also have to look at bias. If someone is doing a website and they're giving the recipe and talking about how much their kids loved this calzone they made at home and how easy it was, that person has a vested interest in getting readers. And so they may be exaggerating how good this thing is. They may be exaggerating how easy it was. Or if it's a professional cook, easy for a professional cook might be a disastrous 3-hour ordeal for someone like me. Now, with calzones, as we've found, tons of primary sources available. So many primary sources, you might not need secondary sources. Scholarly sources, however, are likely going to be harder. You're not going to find a scholarly source that's been peer-reviewed where an academic researcher sat down and studied DP Dough and Uptown Normal to understand the sociological effects of having a calzone place 3 blocks away from the campus of ISU. That kind of source is just not going to be there. And so if you were studying, DP Dough as a restaurant in Uptown Normal, the types of scholarly sources you look for will not be tied directly to that restaurant, but they can give good information. So for example, if you found a scholarly source that talked about the history of Italian food like pizza and lasagna and anything that uses red sauce, that scholarly source will be talking about foods that are related to calzones. So even if that source doesn't mention calzones, that historical context of why we bake foods in this way with these types of ingredients, you can tie that to what the line cook at DP Dough says about how they prepare calzones. All right, does that primary source's description of cooking a calzone match up with what the scholarly source is saying the Romans used to do with the first pizza? That type of analysis, that's where you get to show your thoughts on how these sources are related. Now, let's say you found a business source that was talking about marketing and keeping a business afloat in a location like Normal, Illinois. Let's say you had a scholarly source that was, following an art gallery and how they used social media marketing to stay in business during COVID in the middle of Massachusetts. Okay, all right. There's no mention of food, no mention of calzones, no mention of Illinois even. But that scholarly source, if they are talking about Facebook and they're talking about Twitter and they're talking about how this small company used social media to draw in customers during a pandemic, you could go back to your primary sources from DP Dough and see, did they use the same strategies? Are you seeing parallels between what they did during COVID to maintain a customer base versus this art gallery in Massachusetts? So with this, bear in mind that each of your topics will be challenging in unique ways. No two topics are the same. Every topic is going to be complicated. And so as you look for your sources, be sure that you are following what looks right. Be sure that you are, finding sources that are giving good information. And if a source doesn't seem like a good source, you don't have to use it. Do not fall into this trap of thinking you must use every source you find. In reality, for something like Project 2, where you have a 15 source requirement, you should probably be reviewing 50 or more sources and discarding 35 of them or more. Just going through, checking, all right, which titles look good, which abstracts look good. Like when I do a research paper, I will Google a bunch of different terms. I will do multiple searches in Heartland Library, and most of the sources that come up won't be specific enough, and so I may download those PDFs. If I had a 15 source paper, I may end up with somewhere between 40 and 100 PDFs downloaded to a folder so I can review them later. And then when I start reviewing my sources, if I'm reading a source and it just isn't helpful, I skip it. I go to the next one. All right. If the first 3 sentences are telling me that this has nothing to do with my topic, I'm not going to spend a couple hours digesting this source. All right. Spend your time focusing on the sources that are helpful and go from there. Now, one last quick note. Remember too that your experiences with your topic are important and they are helpful. So for example, if you went home and you cooked a calzone yourself, you could describe that experience in your paper, and that would be perfectly appropriate. However, for the purposes of English 102, your personal experiences don't count as your outside sources. One of the key things I'm grading you on is your ability to find those outside sources that are outside your personal experiences. And so you must have 15 sources that are not yourself. But if you're doing that extra mile, looking up a recipe, trying it out yourself, describing, how your experience with the calzone compares with, what the DP dough line cook said versus what the celebrity chef on the food channel is saying versus what this other website said about how their kids love the calzone, comparing your cooking experience with those sources is going to be really helpful. It's going to give us excellent context to better understand those outside sources you've brought in and to ultimately understand the topic of calzones better. So definitely use your personal experiences with your sources. Just remember that the 15 sources you have do not include yourself. So with that, we will be doing the discussion board next week, but please let me know in case of any questions, and I especially recommend using text if you need to get in touch with me quickly, especially next week when I'm on jury duty. There is a chance I won't be able to get to email much. There's a chance I will not have my phone during the day. So with that, have a good rest of the day, and I will see your discussion board posts next week.